In 2014, the Communication Department at Methodist University drew up plans for a special kind of media facility. This facility would house a new, specially designed video editing workstation. A workstation custom designed for editing 4K video, as well as designing high-end graphics for virtual reality. This workstation is now completed. All that you see in this video documenting the construction of these new workstations was created on the very same workstations you see under construction. This is how to build a high-end video workstation from the ground up. The basic components we will be working with are a Coolmaster 69II computer case, the Asus Rampage 4 motherboard, the Intel Core i7 6-core processor, a Firepower ZX 1250 watt power supply, a Coolmaster CPU cooler, 2 Samsung 840 1TB solid-state hard drives. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about today are computer cases, and the case is basically the home for the computer. Its purpose is to protect the components and to provide as much versatility as possible. This case is made by Coolmaster. This is a very good case and it's very versatile. You can see it's got a window in there. It's also got several fans. Now if we open this up, you'll see that there's basically nothing in it. This is where the motherboard's going to go. You can see you've got fans on top, bottom, and the sides. You'll also notice you've got all sorts of pre-installed cabling which is used to communicate with the components from outside. And you'll also see that you have slots where you can put in all of your necessary drives if you have them. Plus these allow you to put larger components that can be seen from the front, such as CD drives, DVD drives, and things of that nature. Okay, the motherboard is essentially something that doesn't actually do anything in itself. It just has a great deal of infrastructure. What you're looking at are very large numbers of tiny integrated circuits and slots that attach to other things. You'll also notice on the back we have a lot of soldered pathways. Those are sharp, and that is one of the reasons why you will probably want to put down some cardboard if you're working on a wooden surface. Okay, this is the processor for the computer. This is what does all the thinking for the computer. Right now the computer doesn't actually have one, so we're going to install this. And this gets installed into the motherboard itself, and as you can see it has a huge number of connections. Huge number of tiny connections that all have to line up. And the other side is where we will apply the heatsink. Okay, what you're looking at now is the actual processor socket where the processor will go. It has a protective cap which must be maintained if you're ever going to not use the processor for any reason. And it is held down by 2 springs. And then the actual protective cap can be removed. And you see there's many tiny connections there, and the processor itself fits in only one way. And what you do is you line up the marks. And that's pretty much secure. Then you close the lid and you clamp it down. Now the processor is installed. Okay, now that the processor is installed, we must prep it for the heatsink. The heatsink must be applied with a kind of a paste which has silver in it, which we're going to apply now. I'm going to apply rather liberally on the system. And then we're going to spread that. And be careful not to get any on the rest of the board. The idea is that you want that to cover it nice and evenly. Okay, what you're looking at here is the heatsink. This is the device which cools the processor. Without it, you simply cannot operate it. Okay, the heatsink is made of copper, which is a highly conductive metal. You see it has a fan on either side, and mostly it's composed of little thin sheets of metal called fins, which acts like a radiator, and this will keep that processor very cool. These fans must be on at all times, and this must be in place, or your chip will burn out instantly. And part of installing the heatsink is to get the proper hardware in place. This type of motherboard requires a brace that looks like this. It comes with a couple of others that you can use, but these are the ones for this particular motherboard. And that just screws right on in there. Okay, and we're ready to go. This area here is the back of the system. That's going to be what's pointed out the back, so we have to make sure the fans point in that direction. And we also want to make sure that the name Coolmaster is seen upside down from that perspective, so that we can get the airflow going the right way. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up these little poles here into these little bitty tiny holes in the board. And once that is done, on the top side of the board, we now have some very, very small screws, or bolts rather, which have to bolt on there. And it comes with a tool which allows you to do that. And then we do the one on the other corner. And then you have the processor and heatsink installed. Alright, so you will note that there are two fan power cords. Those are going to plug into this connector, which they provide you with. Then this connector we're going to connect to the board itself at one of the many power jacks, like so. So, with that in place, this system will get plenty of power. Okay, the next step is to install the RAM. RAM chips provide the computer's conscious memory. And so in this case, we actually have more slots than we do RAM chips. The system will have 32 gigabytes of RAM. It's capable of holding 64 gigabytes. So we're going to put the RAM in the light gray slots, because that is the configuration that it will work in with half of the RAM that you will need. And you'll notice there's a groove in the middle of the RAM chip. This has to correspond with the groove in the slot, otherwise it won't work. So we're going to just drop these in, like so, and then push down and lock in place. And one more on that side. Same configuration. Slides down, lock in place. And finally, one of the nice things about this board, it's designed in such a way that it's designed to take that substantially large heatsink without making it hard to put the RAM in. And now we have 32 gigabytes of RAM installed. Okay, this motherboard, the Rampage 4, you'll notice it has the SATA interfaces along the edge, which is actually, I'm not complaining about that. The only problem is it becomes very difficult to access those when it's in the case. And so, experience has told me that we want to connect these up before we get into the case. Now, the first two are designed for SATA 3, the first two banks, and so I'm going to go ahead and plug in the SATA 3 lines. The SATA 3 lines are black. I'm actually going to leave a couple open there because there's going to be a situation where we will need to have an open one later. Now, the remaining 6 that are kind of a light gray color, these use different cables. Those are the SATA 6 lines. So we're going to plug some cables in there. And one more. And that is pretty much all the preparation that we will need before we install the actual board. Okay, before we install the actual board, it's important to understand that there's a cutout that has to go in, which actually goes in from the back, and this is what allows you to plug your stuff in. So you have to make sure you're lining that up properly. And so in this case, the USB and the PS2 port are on top, and so from the inside we put this in here. It's a very cheap piece of metal, but it snaps in place. There really isn't much to it. And there it is. This is the area the computer will go into. As you can see, it's nice and clear, and what you're going to want to do is make sure that the surface area has nothing on it so that it can fit in there without disrupting anything. Before it can go in, though, you have to put these pins in place. These pins are what actually hold the thing in, and they're labeled A, B, and C. Okay, now that we have the case prepared with the studs in place, and we pull the wires out of the way, then we're ready to take the completed board and put it in. Now, as I said, these extraneous cables here, these SATA cables, we're going to put those in ahead of us. Then we line up the board with the external guide on the side there. And so that we can get one of those bolts into the stud. And then we're in a much better position. Now that we have the motherboard installed, it's time to get the system set up so that it is connected to the case. And one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to set up the fans. The case fans draw power from the motherboard. And one of the first things we're going to do is actually remove these molex style connections that they give you, because we're just going to want to plug this directly in to where it's got to go. There we go. Okay, the most important part of this assembly is to allow the computer to be communicated from the outside. So that means that instead of touching the board itself, the board controls can operate the system. Okay, one of the most tedious parts of installing a motherboard is getting these little bitty tiny connectors connected to the outside of the case. This one here says HD LED. That's the little light that comes on when your hard drive is thinking. And that connects right here to these two little tiny poles. And the manual will tell you where to put it in. And you can also see a little diagram down there. This one says Power SW for a power switch, and that goes in over here. And of course we've got the reset switch, which goes here according to the diagram. And finally we have this one, which is separated because the poles are a little bit further apart, and we've got your power LED plus and minus. The plus goes over here. And the minus goes next to it. And when you're done, it should look something like that. Some of these other cords include the USBs for the USB ports that you plug in on the front. Now you'll see that says USB on it. This is the type of connection that would go into. You will notice there is one pin that is blocked off. And the reason why they do that is so that this will only be able to fit in one way, like so. And just push that on in, and you should have another one as well. Another USB goes in like so. Okay, this cord here has to do with the audio connections for the headphones and such, and that goes in over here. Like so. Okay, this cord here, which is also part of the chassis, is for the USB 3 ports, which are the faster USB ports, and believe me, you want to plug this in so that you can have access to those from the front. That goes into this jack here, but there it is. And so that is your USB 3. And the last one is this, which you might recognize as an SATA connector. And that is going to plug in to the open slot that we left for it down here. Like so. And so now you see that we're about ready to bring in some other stuff. Since we're custom building this power supply, we have figured out in advance what connections we need, and we're just going to plug those into the power supply before we install it so that we don't have to plug them in as we need them. And this is the biggest cable of all. That goes to power the whole motherboard. And you notice it says ATX on one side, PSU on the other side. The PSU, of course, goes into the power supply, which we will plug in. There's only one place that it can fit. We're just going to push that in, and this is a little bit of a job to get that in sometimes. And there that is. And we also know that we need several of these other ones, which are color-coded in gray. So we'll plug those in. And we need some of these black ones to power the CPU. And finally we need some of these longer ones. We're taking two of the standard power supply cables for the serial ATA cards and one molex. This is a whole lot easier to do this way than it would be if you were struggling to get your fingers in and around these things when it's in the box. And you can see that basically what you've got to do is line this up so the little holes are in the right place. And then you just put in the bolts. Okay, the motherboard takes several power connections, and the ones way up at the top here I usually try to plug in first because they can be a little bit tricky. Tuck around there. This one here is a little more tricky because it requires half of one of these other cables. And there we are. So the big motherboard connection is the main one, which is this. Okay, now that the power supply is installed, this is the best time to install the graphics cards, which are going to go here in the PCI Express slots. Now these are the graphics cards. These are ASUS graphics cards. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to peel off this protective back off there, because it's quite possible to accidentally leave that on and then the cards will overheat. We're also going to remove this strip here, and the card will fit into that slot, but this little knockout has to be removed because this is where the outside of the card is, and these cards actually take up two of them. So we're going to remove those knockouts, pull these fan wires out of the way, and then it's just a question of sliding it right on in there. Right under the first. And again, I'm going to need to knock these knockouts out. Two of those. And then this will go in right under the first one. And we're also going to attach a cord that connects both of them together. This is called an SLI cord. We'll connect these graphics cards together and allow them to work in unison. And the graphics cards require a great deal of power, and these are actually supplied separately. And the one below. And that should do it for the graphics cards. Okay, this is a high definition audio card, and before we plug that in, make a note that it requires a power connection right there. And so before we're done with the system, that has to be powered up. Okay, we're going to put this in the bottom slot. It's a little bit close back there, but we can get it in. Like so. And then we line it up like that. Now, as I said, at one time we connected what's called a molex connector, which looks like that. And we don't use a lot of molex these days, but molex connectors usually have one of these on the end, these little bitty tiny ones. And that happens to be what this audio card needs. So I'm just going to plug that in, and so the audio card will work. Now we're still going to use the molex. The molex will be used for the power fan on the door of the system. There's one other power fan. We don't plug that into the board, we plug it into this, and that's the only reason why we have this connection coming out of the power supply, for that one fan and to power the audio card. These are solid-state hard drives. As you can see, they're very small, and those are the connection ports. These are not much bigger than business cards. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this plastic bracket. I'm just going to slide this right on in here in such a way that the ports are facing out. That way I can get at it from behind. And I'm just going to take this other drive and put it in right underneath. No screws required. That's all it is. This bay will therefore hold two hard drives. Now this case allows you to install your bays in a very convenient way. Now they have a bracket here which I chose not to use, and I'm just going to go ahead and remove this. I'm going to replace it with this. Just going to put these pins in there, turn this around, and do the same thing on the other side. And ultimately, what we will have is a new bay, which will slide right back in there, like so. And pretty much that's it for getting the hard drives into their position. Now on the other side of the case, we can see where the hard drives are sitting here nice and exposed for us, right back there. And they require two connections. They require a data connection and a power connection. The data connection are the SATA cords that we plugged in before we even installed the motherboard. So here they are, and we're going to just grab one of those and connect it down there. And the other one will connect it to the other drive, which is directly above it, like so. And so that will give us data connection. And we have also threaded through these lines here, which are power connections. And these are these SATA style power connections. I'll plug one of those in like so. And then the other remaining one. And that should be it for the hard drives. DVD drives and such go into the front of the computer here. As you can see, that the case is designed in such a way that you can install as much or as little of these as you want to. In this case, obviously we're going to use a few of these bays. So when you take the cover off, you'll find a little knockout back here, and it's a little bit on the destructive side. Comes right out. And the first one we're going to put in is our Blu-ray burner, and this one just goes right on in here like this. And you'll notice on the side, got the button. Once you push the button, it locks it in place. Okay, and again, below there, we've got the knockout. And we've got our DVD drive. And push the button on the side, lock it in place. Okay, and the next panel down, these are specialized panels we're going to be putting in. Again, we're going to have to pop this out. And this comes with the motherboard. This is an external panel that we can look at the board status from outside the computer. And so it's got a specialized cord which we'll put in there as well. And we'll connect that up on the inside. And silly me, I put it in upside down, haven't I? That's probably better. Lock it in place with the button. And the last thing we're going to install on the front panel is a card reader, because this particular case doesn't come with one, and this is a little bit more complicated. We're going to thread all this stuff through. Some of this stuff we don't actually use, and lock it in. The DVD drive and the Blu-ray drive are here, and those also require a data connection and a power connection. And the SATA connections we've already established. And we have power, jungle of cables here, and another one, and that should establish the CD drive and the DVD drive. And this also requires a power source. There it is. And the monitoring device plugs directly into the motherboard in a very obscure little place, which is right down here. And that is the only connection needed for that. Okay, this secondary system here has to be plugged in. It actually plugs right into the PCI Express slot. That will plug in there, if you can see that. Now that we have the system ready to go, we're going to start putting in the peripherals. Since we have all these wonderful graphics cards, we're going to be plugging in 4 monitors. Okay, and of course we plug in the power cable. And when we plug in our USBs for our peripherals, make it a point. You'll see this is the area of the board that's actually attached directly to the board. So I would recommend that you plug your main peripherals into the very top slots. And that is basically because these are the only ones that are likely to be working. You'll also want to plug in your Wi-Fi antenna, which has these 2 really beautiful gold colored connections. And your Wi-Fi antenna itself, you can place this anywhere. And finally, we're going to plug in our audio devices. Now in this particular case, we have 3 of them. Basically, you've got your front channels, and you've got your side channels, and you've got your subwoofer and your center channels. Now that we've gotten everything assembled, we just do a final once-over and make sure everything is okay. And by that, typically you want to make sure that all of the fans can spin, that there's no cables that are interfering with the fans. Then we turn on the power switch, and as you can see, the lights come on. So that means something's going well. And then we give it the final test by turning on the actual power. And now we see everything starts spinning up. All the fans start turning. And this should be an effective startup. Now that we've established that everything is working, we're going to just close up this case. And that is the end of the hardware assembly. Everything else will be done on a software basis.